Cop punches black man until he bled. Didn't know he was the new police chief. Early morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the city's central police precinct. The day was supposed to mark a new chapter for the department, though no one inside the building knew just how different it would be. A man in his early 40s walked calmly up the steps toward the entrance. He was tall, with steady eyes, and his clothes were simple, just a plain shirt and dark trousers. To any stranger, he looked like an ordinary citizen, perhaps someone with a complaint or a small issue to resolve. But in reality, he was not just another visitor. He was the newly appointed police chief, a man chosen to bring integrity and discipline back to a force that had struggled with scandals and corruption. Yet he had decided not to announce himself right away. He wanted to see how his officers behaved when they believed no one important was watching. Inside the precinct, the mood was casual. Some officers sat around desks with coffee, chatting about their weekend. Others filled out paperwork lazily, glancing at the clock as though waiting for their shift to end before it had even properly begun. The atmosphere was far from professional, and it already gave the newcomer a sense of what needed to change. He stepped into the main hallway quietly, looking around, observing the surroundings, and making mental notes about how the place was run. His presence, however, soon caught the eye of one particular officer, a man with a sharp voice and a reputation for being overly aggressive. The officer narrowed his eyes at the newcomer and frowned. "Hey, you! What are you doing here?" His tone was not one of polite inquiry but of suspicion, as though the man standing there had no right to exist in the same space. The new chief remained calm, answering politely that he had come to see how the precinct operated. But his gentle words were brushed aside as if they carried no weight. The officer stepped closer, towering over him, trying to make him feel small. He demanded identification, and when the man hesitated, choosing not to reveal his true position just yet, the officer's suspicion grew darker. Instead of asking further questions or calling a superior, the officer pushed him roughly against the wall. Other officers nearby turned their heads, curious about the commotion, but none immediately intervened. Some smirked, whispering quietly to each other, assuming this was just another citizen in the wrong place at the wrong time. The man who was secretly their chief raised his hand slightly, not in fear but in a gesture of calm, trying to ease the situation. He explained that he meant no harm, that he was only here to observe. Yet his words were ignored once again. The officer, growing angrier by the second, accused him of trespassing. Without warning, he shoved the man harder and then punched him across the face. The blow landed heavy, splitting the skin near his lip, and blood began to drip slowly down his chin. Gasps filled the air, but not out of sympathy, more out of shock at the boldness of the strike inside their own building. Some laughed nervously, while others stood frozen, unsure whether to stop what was happening. The victim staggered slightly but did not retaliate. He wiped the blood with the back of his hand and looked directly into the officer's eyes with a calm intensity that unsettled him for a moment. Still, the officer, blinded by prejudice and arrogance, did not back down. The new chief could feel his patience wearing thin. It was not just the physical pain that stung, it was the realization of how deep the problem ran within this department. If an officer could so casually use violence against a stranger without justification, what did that mean for the countless citizens who had walked through these doors before him? He looked around the room, scanning the faces of the other officers. Some avoided eye contact, choosing silence over justice. A few looked uncomfortable, their brows furrowed as though they wanted to help but lacked the courage. And then there were those who chuckled, clearly entertained by the display of power. Each reaction told him more about the culture of this place than any official report ever could. He straightened his back and spoke firmly, demanding to see the commanding officer. His tone was sharp now, carrying authority, though still he avoided revealing his true identity. The aggressive officer sneered, mocking him openly. "You don't give orders here. You're nobody," he said with a laugh, unaware of the truth that would soon crush his arrogance. The chief stayed silent after that, letting the moment hang in the air. He was observing, recording every detail in his mind, and preparing for what was to come. Minutes later, footsteps echoed down the hallway. A senior officer entered, scanning the scene quickly. His eyes landed on the bloodied man, and in an instant, recognition washed over his face. His expression shifted from confusion to pure shock. He hurried forward, his voice trembling as he greeted him respectfully, "Chief. I didn't know you had arrived already." The room fell silent. The words hit like thunder, and every officer's expression changed at once. Mouths hung open, whispers spread quickly, and all eyes turned toward the man they had dismissed, mocked, and assaulted. The aggressive officer froze, his face drained of color, realizing that the man he had punched until he bled was not a random stranger but his new boss. The chief didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His silence was heavy, powerful, and suffocating. He dabbed at the blood with a handkerchief, his steady gaze moving across the room, locking eyes with each officer one by one. They shifted uncomfortably under his stare, knowing that every action or inaction they had shown in the past few minutes had been seen and remembered. The atmosphere, once casual and careless, was now filled with fear and shame. The chief had come to witness the truth of his department, and what he had seen in his first hour was more revealing than any official meeting could ever be. This was not just about one officer's aggression, it was about the culture that allowed it to happen. And though the day had only just begun, everyone in that precinct knew their lives and careers were about to change forever. The room stayed painfully quiet after the senior officer's slip of the tongue revealed the truth. The man everyone had mocked and mistreated was, in fact, the new chief. The aggressive officer who had thrown the punches stood frozen in disbelief. His hands twitched nervously at his sides, and beads of sweat began to appear on his forehead. The laughter that had filled the hall minutes before was gone. Now, every eye darted between the new chief and the officer who had struck him. No one dared to speak. The chief, still bleeding slightly from his lip, straightened his shoulders. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. His silence carried more weight than anger ever could. He looked slowly around the room, memorizing every face. The officers who had smirked moments ago now stared at the floor. Those who had stayed quiet shifted uncomfortably in their seats, guilt washing over them. And a few younger officers looked at him with wide eyes, torn between fear and respect. The aggressive officer finally broke the silence. "Yes, sir, I didn't know. I didn't mean." His words stumbled out clumsily, but the chief raised his hand to stop him. The gesture was simple but final. It said everything. Excuses would not erase what had just happened. The chief then spoke for the first time since the truth was revealed. His voice was calm but firm, carrying through the hall like a judge passing sentence. "I asked to speak to the commanding officer. I was mocked. I asked for respect. I was attacked. And all of you watched." His words sank into the room like heavy stones. Some officers shifted uncomfortably, others swallowed hard, but no one dared to respond. The chief walked slowly across the floor, his footsteps echoing. He stopped near the group of younger officers who had looked uneasy during the assault. "You," he said, pointing to one of them. The young man's face flushed red. "You knew something was wrong. Why didn't you act?" The officer stammered, his voice trembling. I was afraid of going against my colleague." The chief nodded slightly, not in approval but in recognition of the honesty. "Fear is natural," he replied softly. "But fear does not excuse silence in the face of injustice." The words struck the room deeply. Every officer knew he was not just speaking to one man, but to all of them. The aggressive officer, still pale, tried again. "Chief, I thought he was," but once more, he was cut off. The chief's steady eyes locked onto him, and this time his voice grew colder. "You thought he was what? Less than you? You didn't ask questions. You didn't check facts. You let arrogance guide you. And when arrogance takes the lead, justice disappears. The silence that followed was heavier than before. No one could deny the truth of what he said. For years, the precinct had been plagued with rumors of corruption, prejudice, and abuse of power. And now, within minutes of his arrival, the new chief had witnessed it firsthand. His lips still stung from the blow, but his heart ached more for the culture of neglect that surrounded him. The chief then turned toward the senior officer who had recognized him. "You knew I was coming today. Why did you not prepare your men?" The senior officer swallowed hard, shame burning across his face. "Chief, I did not expect," he trailed off, unable to finish. The chief's gaze lingered on him before moving back to the others. "That is exactly the problem. You did not expect accountability. You did not expect to be held to the standard of the badge you wear. You thought this was just another day. But today, everything changes." Some officers looked down at their shoes, while others glanced nervously at the door as if hoping to escape. But the chief was not done. He made his way back to the center of the room, his presence commanding even without raising his voice. "What I saw today is not just one man's mistake. It is the culture of this department. Some of you laughed. Some of you turned away. Only a few of you showed discomfort, and even then, you chose silence. That silence speaks louder than words. It tells me this is not the first time such behavior has happened within these walls. And it will not be the last, unless we change it now." The aggressive officer lowered his head, his earlier confidence gone. He muttered something like an apology, but no one cared to hear it. His colleagues, who once thought him fearless, now saw him exposed and weak. The chief's calm authority made it clear, the days of unchecked arrogance were over. The chief then addressed the room one final time before leaving. "You do not yet understand who I am. You only know the title I carry. But soon, you will learn what I stand for. This badge on your chest is not a license to harm. It is a promise to protect. And I will not allow that promise to be broken again." He turned and began to walk out of the hall. The officers parted silently to let him pass, each one lost in their own thoughts. The sound of his footsteps was the only noise in the building until the door closed behind him. The precinct was left in a heavy silence. Some officers were shaken, realizing they had just witnessed the beginning of something far bigger than themselves. Others were consumed by fear, knowing their behavior might soon cost them their careers. The aggressive officer sat down heavily on a chair, his head in his hands. The reality of what he had done pressed down on him like a weight too heavy to bear. And as the new chief stepped outside into the morning air, wiping the last trace of blood from his lip, he knew the test was not over. What had just happened was only the beginning. The true challenge would be transforming a culture built on arrogance and fear into one of respect and service. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready. Because for him, this was not just a job, it was a mission to restore honor to a badge that had lost its meaning. The next morning brought a different kind of atmosphere to the precinct. The word had spread fast that the man who had been struck and mocked was actually the newly appointed chief of police. Some officers came in with heavy hearts, afraid of what consequences awaited them. Others tried to act as if nothing had happened, though the nervous glances and hushed whispers gave them away. The building that had once been filled with careless chatter now carried a weight of unease. The chief entered quietly, just as he had the day before, but this time no one dared to confront him. He walked down the hallway with slow, deliberate steps. His presence alone commanded respect. The bruise on his lip was still visible, a reminder of what had occurred. He carried no anger in his expression, but there was a firm determination that made every officer straighten their posture as he passed. He called for a meeting in the briefing room. Within minutes, the space was filled with rows of officers, sitting stiffly in their seats. Some avoided eye contact, others looked directly at him with expressions of regret, while a few still wore the same hardened looks of arrogance. The aggressive officer sat in the back, his head lowered, knowing his fate was hanging by a thread. The chief stood at the front, looking over the room. He didn't raise his voice. His calm tone carried clearly, demanding attention without effort. "Yesterday," he began, "I saw the true state of this department. I saw pride, arrogance, fear, and silence. I saw laughter when there should have been action. And I saw a badge used as a weapon instead of a shield." His words sank deep, and the silence that followed was thick. He walked slowly, making eye contact with each row. "Some of you may think what happened yesterday was just a mistake. A moment of bad judgment. But I tell you it was more than that. It was a window into the culture that has been allowed to grow here. A culture where aggression is mistaken for strength, where silence is chosen over courage, and where respect is reserved only for those who look or act a certain way. That ends today." A few younger officers shifted in their seats, nodding slightly as if agreeing with him. The chief noticed. He knew not everyone in this room was beyond redemption. But he also knew that change would not come easy. He turned his gaze toward the officer who had struck him. The man sat frozen, his face pale. "Stand," the chief ordered. Slowly, the officer rose to his feet, his shoulders hunched. All eyes turned toward him. The chief's expression remained calm, but his words were sharp. "Yesterday, you did not see me as a man. You saw me as a target. You chose violence before reason. You mocked when you should have asked questions. And others allowed it. Do you have anything to say?" The officer's voice cracked as he tried to speak. "Chief, I made a mistake. I didn't know," but the chief raised his hand again, stopping him. "You didn't know? That's the problem. You didn't know who I was, so you thought you could treat me any way you pleased. If you had known my title, you would have bowed your head. But a badge does not give you the right to judge who deserves respect. Everyone deserves respect. Title or not." The room was silent again, heavy with guilt. The chief let the words linger before continuing. "This badge," he said, tapping the one pinned to his chest, "is not a crown. It is a responsibility. It is not for arrogance. It is for service. If you cannot carry it with humility, you do not deserve to carry it at all." The officer's eyes dropped to the floor. He knew there was no defense left. The chief then shifted his attention back to the room. "I will not build this department on fear or silence. I will build it on accountability and respect. That means changes will come. Some of you may not like them. Some of you will resist. But understand this change is not an option anymore. It is a necessity." He announced that from that day forward, every officer would undergo training focused not just on procedures but on respect, communication, and community trust. There would be new systems of accountability. Complaints from citizens would be reviewed directly by his office. And any act of abuse, whether witnessed or ignored, would carry consequences for everyone involved. Some officers shifted uneasily, already imagining the difficulties ahead. But others sat a little taller, inspired by his words. For years they had longed for leadership that would break the cycle of arrogance and neglect. Now, they felt that hope stirring. As the meeting came to an end, the chief paused before leaving the room. His final words were quiet, yet powerful. "Yesterday I was tested. And so were you. Some of you failed. Some of you stayed silent. But all of you were given a chance to see yourselves clearly. Remember this moment, because it will not be forgotten. The badge is heavy. If you cannot carry it with honor, it will be taken from you." He left the room, and again, the silence remained. No one spoke for a long while. The officers sat with the weight of his words pressing on them. The arrogant ones were filled with fear, knowing their days were numbered. The silent ones felt shame, realizing they had chosen comfort over courage. and the few who had always wanted change now felt the beginning of something new. The aggressive officer sat back down, his head in his hands. His career was slipping away, and deep inside he knew he had no one to blame but himself. Meanwhile, the new chief returned to his office. He knew the journey ahead would be long and difficult, but he felt certain of one thing: he had already begun to turn the tide. The following day arrived with heavy clouds hanging over the city, as if the sky itself mirrored the mood inside the precinct. The chief had spent the previous night in deep thought, planning how to turn words into action. He knew speeches alone could not change hearts or fix years of bad culture. Discipline, training, and accountability had to follow. The officers were about to learn that their new leader was not one who would let things slide. He called for another gathering in the main hall, but this time he made sure every officer, from the most senior to the newest recruit, was present. The room filled slowly, with uneasy faces and quiet whispers. The aggressive officer who had struck him stood stiffly near the back, his eyes lowered, fearing every moment. The chief waited until the last seat was filled before he began. His voice was steady, carrying the weight of authority. Yesterday, I gave you all a chance to look at yourselves in a mirror. Today, we start holding that mirror up every single day. This department cannot survive on arrogance, on silence, or on fear. We will change how we treat people, and we will change how we treat each other. He then outlined his first decision. Every officer who had been involved in the incident, whether by action or by silence, would face an internal review. He made it clear this was not about punishment alone but about accountability. When you wear this badge, he said firmly, you are not just individuals. You are part of a team that represents law, justice, and the trust of the people. If you betray that, you betray everyone. The aggressive officer shifted uncomfortably, sweat gathering on his brow. He finally spoke up, his voice cracking. Chief, I made a mistake. I was wrong. Please, give me another chance. The chief looked at him with calm eyes. Your actions were not a mistake, they were a choice. You chose aggression over respect. You chose humiliation over professionalism. And worse, others chose to watch. The room was silent, no one daring to interrupt. The chief then announced the suspension of the aggressive officer, pending full disciplinary review. Gasps filled the air. For years, such behavior had gone unchecked. But now, everyone understood that there was a new standard. After addressing discipline, the chief turned to reform. He introduced mandatory training programs that would cover not just the law, but empathy, communication, and respect for all communities. He explained that citizens walking into the station should feel safe, not afraid. If we cannot serve with compassion, we do not deserve the authority we hold, he reminded them. He then pointed to the younger officers in the room. You are the future of this department. You will be the ones to rebuild trust. Do not let the mistakes of others become your habits. His words inspired some, who felt for the first time that their efforts could matter. The chief also addressed those who had laughed during the incident. He didn't call them out by name, but his words pierced their hearts. Laughter at injustice is worse than silence. It means you find comfort in cruelty. That will not exist under my leadership. He ended the meeting with a powerful declaration. This precinct is no longer a place for arrogance. It will be a place of service, of respect, and of honor. Those who cannot adapt will not remain. When the meeting ended, officers left the hall with mixed emotions. Some were relieved, grateful for a leader who stood for fairness. Others were fearful, realizing their careless actions were now under scrutiny. The aggressive officer left with his head hung low, the weight of his suspension crushing his pride. The chief returned to his office and looked out the window at the city below. He thought of the people who depended on him, citizens who wanted protection, not intimidation. He knew change would take time, but he also knew he had taken the first necessary steps. The bruises on his face would heal, but the lessons from that first day would never fade. And so, the chief set his pen to paper, beginning to draft the new code of conduct for the precinct. For the first time in years, there was hope that the department could truly transform. And it all started with one painful, unforgettable lesson: respect must come before authority. The days after the suspension of the aggressive officer marked the beginning of a new chapter for the precinct. The chief moved with quiet confidence, but his presence carried a power that made everyone pay attention. No longer could the officers treat their work as routine or their authority as untouchable. Every step, every word, every action was being watched closely, and they knew it. The chief began each morning walking through the precinct, greeting officers not with arrogance but with steady respect. Some were surprised by his humility, expecting him to hold grudges after what had happened. Instead, he chose to lead by example. He spoke to the janitor as warmly as he did to the senior sergeant, reminding everyone that respect had no rank. Slowly, the tone of the building started to shift. Conversations grew quieter, more thoughtful. The careless laughter that once filled the halls was replaced with a focus on work. But transformation was never easy. Many officers struggled with the new rules and expectations. Some grumbled in corners, whispering that the chief was being too strict, too demanding. Others secretly admired his courage, realizing he was giving them a chance to restore pride to the badge they wore. The younger recruits especially saw hope in him. They had joined the force dreaming of justice, but had been met with cynicism. Now, for the first time, they felt that dream might not be lost. The community outside also began to notice changes. Citizens who once avoided the precinct out of fear slowly started to walk through its doors with more confidence. Complaints were no longer brushed aside. People were listened to. Problems were addressed. Word spread quickly that the new chief was different. He was serious about respect and accountability. Local newspapers picked up the story of his unannounced arrival and the shocking treatment he endured. The headline captured attention everywhere: "New chief tests his own officers, exposes hidden culture." The city was stunned, and people's trust in the department began to slowly return. For many, the image of the new chief standing calmly after being assaulted, refusing to retaliate, and instead choosing reform over revenge, became a symbol of strength. Inside the precinct, discipline continued. Officers who had laughed during the assault faced warnings and mandatory retraining. Those who had stayed silent were called into private meetings where the chief reminded them of their duty to step forward in moments of injustice. He didn't dismiss everyone who made a mistake, but he made sure no one walked away unchanged. The message was clear: silence was no longer protection. The aggressive officer, meanwhile, faced a formal investigation. He tried to plead his case, but the evidence was too strong, and the culture had shifted too far. Eventually, he was dismissed from the force. The news spread quickly, serving as a powerful reminder that the new chief meant what he said. Some officers feared him for this, but others respected him more deeply. One evening, as the chief prepared to leave his office, a young officer knocked on his door. Nervously, the young man stepped in and said, "Chief, I wanted to thank you. Yesterday, when you spoke about courage, it made me realize I've been silent too many times. I joined this job to protect people, not to hide behind others. I want to do better." The chief smiled, his tired eyes softening. "That's all I ask," he replied. "Not perfection, but a willingness to do better." The young officer left the room feeling lighter, carrying with him a renewed sense of purpose. Weeks turned into months, and slowly the precinct began to change its reputation. Officers walked with more discipline, spoke with more care, and treated visitors with more respect. Community meetings were held, where citizens and officers sat together to rebuild trust. There were still challenges, still moments of resistance, but progress was undeniable. The chief knew he had not only reformed a department but had planted a seed for a new way of policing, one where authority was matched with humility, and power was balanced by responsibility. His own bruises had healed long ago, but the lessons from that first day remained etched in everyone's memory. In the end, the man who walked into the precinct in plain clothes, treated like a nobody, left an unforgettable legacy. He proved that leadership was not about shouting or demanding fear, it was about living the values you expect from others. And every officer who served under him would carry that lesson for the rest of their careers. For the community, for the city, and for the future, the chief became more than a leader. He became a symbol of change, showing that even in the darkest cultures, light can break through when one person has the courage to stand tall.